Strategy Execution Unlocked and the 5th episode in our OGs of Strategy Execution series. In this series, we'll meet with the pioneers who helped shape the strategy execution space. Guests will include industry analysts, authors, founders of both management consultancies and software companies, and of course, industry practitioners. Today, I'm excited to welcome Vernon Smith to the show. Vernon is a business and enterprise architecture guru. During his career, he has run business and enterprise architecture practices for large enterprises in both the public and private sector. Was also the founder of FIOS Insight, where he led the development and commercialization of Insight EA, which was a Gartner-recognized Magic Quadrant participant, as in the EA Magic Quadrant. Vernon, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Ben. Good to be here.
So I'm excited about this episode because, as you know, I believe that business and enterprise architecture are foundational processes for strategy execution. Maybe I think the best way to start is maybe start with an overview of your career and maybe how you've seen the architectures, both those architectures, evolve during this time.
Okay. Well, hi, thank you. I've been doing this a long time. This is very grey hair. It's not as old as the 400-year-old house behind me, but it's pretty old. So I first started in this space in a very traditional sort of IT career. I started out as a programmer. I actually started out as a computer operator, loading tapes onto IBM Series 34s and 36s, but we don't really want to go there. When I started seeing a bigger picture was my sort of early part of career was with one of the world's largest oil companies. Don't need to name it, but it was in Holland, so you can probably guess. And there I held the role of data analyst, which then grew into the more grandiose data designer. And I started getting a feel for why data and information is so intrinsic to what we do. At the end of the day, it's information technology. It's what the I stands for. So it sits underneath everything. And then over the years, I worked with a number of different oil companies, normally in the data and information space, then sort of pivoted a little bit into the defense world at the end of sort of early 1990s, and then started going a bit broader, going beyond data and information, starting to look at the applications that process that data, the rules that govern it. And we didn't really have a name for it then. John Zackman was calling it enterprise architecture. Did a little bit of stuff with him and with his old business partner way back when, but that was all very new to me. And then the first time it really sort of came together for me was in 1990, working for part of NATO, where my role was to design what we would now call an operating model. Again, didn't have a name for it back then. It wasn't really called architecture then even, but it was a single way of looking at the information and the assets that this particular subdivision of NATO needed, the IT systems that processed those, how they spoke to their suppliers and their partners outside of their immediate ecosystem, and then the security around all of that, and then the flow of it, the processes that were observed or the procedures. And that was my first real taste for, this is really interesting. This ties everything together. Roll it forward a number of years because we've only got a relatively short amount of time and I'm not going to spend it all on my resume or CV, depending on which side of the Atlantic you're on. I then landed in my first big architecture role. Again, we didn't really have a name for it then. We were calling it enterprise architecture, but we didn't have the name business architecture. But that's effectively what we were doing. And this was for the UK government. It was bringing back together two huge departments that had separated many years before. It was forming what we now call HMCE, which is His Majesty's Customs and Excise. Back then it was Her Majesty's, but that's not a big difference. And that was bringing together the taxation department, so the equivalent of the IRS in the States, and the customs and excise department, so that's border control and VAT and that sort of thing, bringing all that together into one sort of holistic operating department. And what we needed to do to set that massive transformation program underway, and that was actually the first time I'd come across the phrase transformation program, technology transformation program they called it, is we had to build an operating model. And that was a view of what are the capabilities that each part of this new department needs as they come together. What are the processes that sort of sit underneath that? What's the IT they require? what's the information that it needs to consume and create, what's the security view of it, and all those different sort of aspects of it. And that's the first time I really sort of saw the big picture of business architecture and the power of it. And then rolling that forwards, I went on from there through a couple of other smaller government roles, then landed in probably my biggest role I've ever done, which was heading up global architecture for what was then one of the world's biggest banks. Really interesting. Started out in private banking, moved into the corporate function. That role took me all over the world. It took me to North America initially, which is how I ended up over there for a number of years and met the fine Mr. Chamberlain and a lot of other folks. And that was real soup to nuts architecture. That was everything from strategic planning to capability improvement to application portfolio rationalization, IT or technology rationalization underneath the portfolio, information, data lineage, data taxonomy, all of those things, all of which come together to form what architecture is. It's the plumbing underneath an enterprise. It's the city plan now and in 10 years' time. It's all of those things that you hear about when people talk about architecture. Roll that forward another number of years. I stayed with the bank quite a few years, but then sort of got a little bit of an itch to go and do something different. That's when I first started getting into the tooling space, because we'd been using a couple of the big sort of industry tools and they really weren't doing what we needed. They didn't really cover the business architecture side of things in the context of enterprise architecture. There are pure business architecture tools out there. There are pure EA tools out there. There are pure process tools out there. And I and a couple of my colleagues at the time felt that they didn't really sort of pull everything together. So that's why we built the tool that Ben was talking about in the introduction then. Rolled that forward another couple of years. We grew that. It became commercially successful. As Ben says, we were recognized by Gartner in the EA Magic Quadrant. And that's when Ben and I started working together. Does that bring it up to date enough, sir?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right.
I mean, I guess it's just thinking about this while you were talking, right? I mean, business architecture, enterprise architecture, there seems to be a distinction, but feels like there's a lot of overlap between the two, or maybe let's rephrase that. They're two sides of the same coin, right? I mean,
yeah. Yes. I mean, at the end of the day, they're both describing the same thing. They're describing what the organization does or what the organization aspires to do, the current state and the target state. And they're describing it from different viewpoints. So enterprise architecture leads with the sort of traditional technological viewpoint, the application viewpoint. Business architecture leads with the capability, the value stream, the process. So it's the what and the how. They are joined.
One logically should lead the other, though, right? Because if you have, if you look at a capability, or your definition of it's going to be better than mine, but part, process, people, tool, right? The technology is supporting that, right? So, should business architecture lead enterprise architecture, or is enterprise architecture tail wagging the dog a little bit? Or?
Depends on who you ask. And having held both roles, I can see both sides of that one. It also depends on the type of organization. I mean, if you're looking at a very technologically savvy organization, I mean, to look at banks, for example, they typically will lead with enterprise architecture. They will lead with the technology view. They will lead with the application and the precise definition of digital products and all those sort of things, and then almost back into business architecture. Of course, in an ideal world, complete greenfield, one would always start with strategy and with a vision, and then develop a capability view of that, and then develop a value stream view over that to say how are the capabilities needed to be used. The reality is most organizations understand their technology and their applications and their data better than they understand their strategy at that level. I mean, obviously at the board level, they've got a vision on what they want the company to do, but strategic business architecture isn't something that organizations lead with as much as I feel they should.
Yeah, and that could be based on what you said, based on what you saw during your career, right? Enterprise architecture with an IT-centric focus was around before the term business architecture arrived. And, I think, go ahead.
I was going to say, and we were starting to recognize that. So while I was in the role with the big bank I was talking about, I also represented that bank on the board of a group called the Open Group, who developed a sort of very well-known global standard for enterprise architecture called TOGAF. And TOGAF always had, so it's made up of 8 phases, and phase B was business architecture. It was relatively lightly defined, and then there was a second sort of view on business architecture that was developed by the Business Architecture Guild, who are a great bunch of people. If you want to know more about business architecture, have a look at them, have a look at what the Open Group are doing. They define it far better than I can in a 5-minute conversation. But what we've seen is that those two have converged now, and the definition is becoming a lot clearer. But yes, TOGAF grew out of DODAF and MODAF from the Ministry of Defence in the UK and the Department of Defence in the States, and was always a sort of formalised approach to technology architecture. And then the business part came along, and it's necessary. It's absolutely necessary to have that business lens on architecture. Otherwise, it's always a technology first view, and as such, it's never going to resonate as much with the business sponsors.
No, I think that makes sense. No, I also think maybe because obviously when you and I work together, I represent how I think about strategy execution, right? It's the the Venn diagram or the intersect between critical processes that are often managed by different folks. So strategic portfolio management, business architecture. We just talked about the distinction of roles between business architecture and enterprise architecture, different forms of project execution that occur across the organization. Of course, the all-important change management. What's interesting to me when I think about how the areas that I know better, so portfolio management and project management evolved, very much was driven through IT, right? Because IT had to get their ducks in a row. They had to, understand the business strategy and look at the capacity issues that IT had and figure out which projects should be working on.
Yeah,
could be similar in terms of the architectures, right? Driven out of a need to organize IT relative to the business, but now you're going to see a push to the enterprise, as we're seeing within project and portfolio management, the need to have an enterprise function that harmonizes across everything. So I imagine the importance of business architecture as you start to get that enterprise view and standardization of how all execution should occur across the organization is going to become more important.
It is. I mean, I was just thinking when you and I were talking about this recently, how I would view the rest of strategy execution from my sort of, I don't think blinkered, but a sort of my particular view on the world being always the view of an architect. And the way I see it is that the business and the business and the enterprise architecture very clearly define the current state, what your world is now, and you can go as deep as you like in understanding the minutiae of that, but you need to understand enough of it, and the target state. If you think of those as a pair of bookends, and then you've got strategy execution flowing underneath to get you from the start to the end. Don't know if those are coming out the right way around, but to me, that's the beginning and that's the end. So reverse it on the screen if you need to.
Yeah, but my point on this is it takes a village, to master strategy execution, and I feel like every function, whether you're more centered on the discretionary side of things in terms of managing the overall program initiative project portfolios in terms of how that relates to strategy, whether it's looking at the overall operating model through the both architectures, business and enterprise architecture, whether you're focus on change management, which is critical too, and kind of elevating change management as the core function here to make a difference, right? I think everyone has an important role to play. They have their own processes needed to support that role, and there's often overlap between these things. So to me, it's like, if this gets elevated to the enterprise, as I think it needs to do, as in a function that looks to orchestrate strategy execution and in turn bring these key processes and roles together, how do you, how is that achieved, at the enterprise level?
Yeah, I mean, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? Or a lot more than $1 million to most organizations. How is it achieved at the enterprise level? It needs to be taken more seriously than it currently is. It needs to be more visible than it currently is. It needs to be more measurable than it currently is. All of those things are lacking as far as I can see. Um, and one of the questions that you asked me on this, what does strategy execution mean to me? I was excited when I first met you and started understanding the rest of this world, because I didn't really know about it before. I was architect in my ivory tower doing what architects do, and everybody else is just out there. And architecture is always ever going to be a third of the picture. Without strategy execution, it's never going to be real. And to me, that's what that's what's not seen well enough in organizations at the moment. Architecture sort of sits there and defines what the world looks like and sends down little edicts, and it's not really joined up enough with the rest of strategy execution. It should be a completely symbiotic relationship, and it's not. I know that's not quite answering your question, but it's a rabbit hole I really wanted to go down.
No, it's exactly how I see the world, right? I feel like different functions, whether it's from architecture perspective, whether it's PMO or enterprise PMO or whatever those offices are, change management has kind of become ever important, but everyone's jostling to put their important process at the top of the pyramid because it is the silver bullet that's going to solve strategy execution. Where I think that actually when you break down these processes, they all start with the clear definition of strategy, right? Coming down into each of their domains. And there's a lot of overlap and redundancy that exists within these processes. So can you get the multiplier effect by bringing them all together, right? To build that cohesive operating model that gives you, your current state, your target state, gives you a great way of, interpreting the major initiatives from strategy, understanding the impact on the business enterprise architecture, executing them effectively, and of course the all-important change. And now, to me, I talk a lot about the 10 key principles to mastering strategy execution, and ultimately it requires the executive buy-in, right? That this is a critical discipline to solve, right? Which I do see enterprise functions being generated today, whether that's to redefine the operating model, or whether that's to create an enterprise PMO or an overall change management office, right? But they're all approaching it from their specific domain. Whereas I see the need for first executives to realize that value is being lost, through poor strategy execution capabilities, right? And they've got to do something about that. To do something about that, it requires the creation of an enterprise function dedicated to personalizing an operating model or governance framework that's right for the organization, that integrates these functions, integrates these processes to build a way of working that is right for that organization. And I think then we'll start to get somewhere, right? Because it won't just be, we've got to down tools and redefine our operating model, or we want to just focus on our project portfolio governance model. It's going to be, how do you pick through this multi-year journey, right? Almost repairing the plane as it's flying, right? And get it right. And I've seen organizations doing a reasonable job in one of those areas, but not necessarily in all of those areas combined. And I think that is the opportunity going forward.
It is, but then also there's the biggest problem that we have to solve in just looking at it from an architecture point of view. To be successful in an organization, you have to be able to effectively answer the so what question. And you said it just now, building a whole new target operating model. So what? What does that actually do for the organization? Well, what it does, for example, I'm thinking about a fairly recent one that you and I were both involved with. By rebuilding a target operating model, by redefining the client's products and the organizational structure that supports those products, we could tie that directly to improved capability maturity, improved quality of the processes, the people, the data, and the technology, or lowered cost of those things, or more standardization of those things across the planet, that lead directly to lowered cost and lowered time to execute for that business capability, which then can be linked across. You can see where it occurs in the different value streams. That will then link it to the goals and objectives and the outcomes that the company is looking to get. if we can take that same approach and same discipline to our own craft, to the building of the architecture, to the building out of um, the enterprise PMO, to the building out of the strategy execution of the change engine that allows us to do to create those sort of end deliverables for the client, then I think they will start seeing more value in what we're doing ourselves. If we don't do that, there's always a risk that we'll be seen as an overhead rather than as an enabler and a value add to the business.
Yeah, and other episodes on this, and I spoke to other OGs. A number have said, well, no, because why, in my opinion, I'm surprised that executives don't see strategy execution as a suboptimal capability at large and look to optimize that capability because it's key for the business operating, it's key to driving value and values being hemorrhaged. So why are they not seeing that? And a couple of people have said, well, they just haven't experienced enough pain yet, right, to make that. So in other words, it needs to be a reactive decision versus a proactive decision. And I was talking to another guy the other day about, well, if this was a manufacturing line or something like that, you're going to look at it, you're going to optimize that as much as you could over time, right, to make sure you're getting the right throughput. Same thing with the overall. I'm a believer that value is being lost at the moment through poor business value. That is being hemorrhaged through poor strategy execution capabilities, and is seeping through the cracks where these processes are converging to a degree, right? And these functions are converging. And I think just looking, using that manufacturing line example, looking to optimize that and plug those gaps by building that cohesive operating model over time, right? Because we don't down tools and try and figure it out, right? How do you ease into that, which may or may not need necessarily a $20 million consulting check paid to get you off the ground floor, right? You could just start to establish that function and start to look at processes across the organization, right? I think that's needed.
It is. I mean, I still come back to, I think the fundamental problem, and just sorry, thinking of your comment just now about one of the other folks you were interviewing. I'm going to be slightly kinder to the business execs and say it's not that they're failing to see the value of strategy execution. It's they don't potentially even know what it is. It's not something their business does. It's something that happens on the side of their business, and therefore it's not affecting anything directly that they can see value in. So why would they ever feel that business value is being hemorrhaged there? I agree it is, but I think it's incumbent on all of us to show the business in very clear terms that that is happening.
Yeah, but I think you're exactly right, because I think to a degree these guys and girls are running the business. They're not experts in business architecture. They're not experts in enterprise architecture. They're not experts in any flavor of portfolio management and project management or change management. And there's a danger when practitioners like ourselves come to them and start talking about the macro, the minutiae of our crafts, that they glaze over pretty quickly. From
absolutely,
that the value stream stage, or from different project execution technique X and Y agile is better than waterfall and blah blah blah. To me, that's
our internal engine.
That's the how, but the why is you need to solve this because listen, it goes back to what I was saying about that. If this was a product or a manufacturing line or something like that, you're going to optimize it, right? Because there's money to be made, right? In that optimization, I feel the same way that to truly master the art and science of strategy execution, it's going to require that executive buy-in, right? And I don't have the answer in terms of how to get that buy-in. I think that's something I want to work with the community to establish, right? Which is proactively identifying the pain versus reacting to the pain, right? And then working to come up with a macro operating model, right, which maybe shields them from all the minutia, which needs to be there, but do they need to know?
Yeah, but no, that's internal to us.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, but to take your manufacturing or your production line analogy a stage further, we need to be recognised as being part of the production line rather than we're the paint that's on the wall. And changing that might make the factory look nicer, but it won't affect the flow of the production line. We need to be in the game, and some organisations are seeing that. A lot of them aren't.
Yeah. No.
Yeah. It's a nice cheery note, isn't it? Sorry about that.
Oh, I think it goes to the heart of the problem. Like I say, I
Mm,
mean, as I've started looking at this space more broadly and established strategy execution
mm,
forum, I'm seeing all these different communities out there that are approaching it from their angle, right? How this is going to
yeah,
solve the problem, I'm a believer that we're all, we've all got to recognize that the sum is greater than all the parts, right? And can we build a process in the organization or a capability in the organization, right, that is optimized, that brings all these all together? And again, it may be different for each organization, right? Because I'm
sure.
also a believer that these one size fits all methodologies, right?
Don't actually fit
As
anybody.
another guest said, fit no one, right? And I feel like
Yeah,
that's the problem, right? They need to be heavily personalized to the idiosyncrasies, culture, industry, right,
yeah,
of each organization, right?
yeah, without a doubt. Yeah.
I guess when you think about the architectures and project and portfolio management,
Mm.
how do you see the synergies there?
Well, that comes back to what I was saying was this sort of big epiphany that I had when I decided to get out of the architecture ivory tower and see that the rest of the world was necessary to make things actually change in business. Um, I think, and this is something I'm concentrating on with the next business that I'm getting involved in now, which is something new in the tooling space. It's it's got to it's got to exist a lot tighter together. We've got to integrate traditional architecture with process and process improvement. We've got to the outcome of every architectural decision should be the beginning of a change, and the beginning of a change should be the beginning of a new. I don't know the terminology because I'm not a PMO guy, as you know, but it should to me be the beginning of another line in a strategic plan somewhere. There's no point in having an architecture which just talks about an aspirational future. You've got to have a practical way of getting there, and then the value that my world of architecture brings to that is that all of those threads can see each other. They can all understand each other. You can see if you pull one in one direction and change that process, what difference is that going to make to other capabilities? What difference is it going to make to your IT landscape? If you start pulling out Jenga blocks, does it really fall down, or does it just get lighter and more efficient? Um, I've turned the conversation around to being an architect again, haven't I? But you knew I was going to do that.
No, that's absolutely.
Same as it ever was.
So what about? I mean, maybe you answered this, but when we think about, I don't know, you're starting a new venture. When you think about this space evolving
Hmm.
in 3 to 5 years, how do you see it evolving?
Oh, that's a big one. We've managed to go the whole of this conversation without mentioning the dreaded AI, haven't we? So we'll probably leave that one on the side there. But I think it is going to have more of a role to play in it, certainly in terms of. Um, I think the architecture is going to fundamentally change. It's going to become more process centric. It's got to, because at the end of the day, that's how people see their business. Is what do they do, and it's how do they do it. That's what matters. And bringing AI more to the fore in terms of process improvement, in terms of capability optimization, I think we'll be relying a lot more on industry reference models, which keep growing and keep evolving, and then use that to define the gaps, use that to drive the gaps from where you are to where you need to be, what best practice looks like. Um, that's just where I see the architecture world going a lot more. I see architecture and strategy execution converging a lot more. I'm certainly intending to do that in the new tooling, that we will have links into a number of different sort of project and program tools, but that's old thinking. What we need is, I did sort of answer it just now, but I'll try and word it slightly better this time. For every architectural decision that's made, so say for example you're looking at rationalizing your application portfolio, so you bring all the estate information into the tool, you ask it a bunch of questions, maybe let some AI loose on it to optimize a little bit, and then you come up with what parts of your estate can you tolerate, what should you invest in, what should you migrate, what should you eliminate, to use Gartner's terminology. The result of that in a traditional architecture tool is there's a time chart, there's a picture of what you should do, give it to somebody else so they can go and do it. I believe we should be saying, here is the result of that analysis. This says that these 27 applications can be demised, which results in this technology can be taken out of your organization and sunset, reducing your overall operating costs, reducing your technical debt. That should directly feed into, this is the initiative that will work on that. These are the gains from it. This is what we know about the operating costs of it. This is sort of a stub project. And we should be generating those things hundreds of times a day in a large organization. They should all be feeding into a continuously evolving plan. And that's the point at which I would, as an architect, step away from it, but I don't want to. I want to actually be involved in seeing how that then closes the loop back round to defining the new current state architecture, so that we can then, on the architecture side, be driving forward to the next target state. So I see it converging, and I see it becoming sort of self-evolving.
That makes sense. I mean, I was talking to another guest again on the project program and portfolio side the other day, and I asked the same question: what's next? AI came up. Of course, it's come up every time. I asked that question, but no one can really quantify exactly how it's going to impact. But it's going to have an impact. But overall, his point was, well, actually, I don't think that these disciplines, and I see business architecture degree based on what we've talked about, have become mainstay yet, right? They've been, they're not, and I kind of see for strategy execution, which is maybe going to, on high tide all ships rise, whatever the expression is, right? It's going to lift everything, right? Because if this becomes an enterprise discipline, to me, business architecture and strategic portfolio management, right, are probably two of the most critical disciplines, right? Assuming that, project management is harmonized by portfolio management, and to a degree enterprise architecture, fits into supporting the business architecture, right?
Yeah.
And change management is going to drive that across the entire organization. I think if this becomes an enterprise discipline, then the stuff that we've been talking about for years is going to become top of mind for more organizations, become mainstream, and then we can figure out together with more smarter people, right? How that should actually be, integrated and optimized and deployed across an organization, which is going to be, in my opinion, will be different will have to be personalized for each organization to fit their unique culture and idiosyncrasies and industry. And I think that's the opportunity. Yes, AI is going to do things, but can we have that aha moment with the executives that strategy execution needs to be optimized to accelerate and drive business value that's currently being eroded? And if so, how do you pick through these parts that need to come together, right, and build something that's optimized for the organization?
And I think we have to be more out there in the way we do that. We've tried doing it by stealth for so many years, and it's limited success, because when you do a good job, particularly with business architecture, nobody really notices that. They notice the business improving, but it's really hard to credit it back to business has improved because we optimize your value stream, and we optimize the capabilities that are underneath it, and we standardize those with your information model, which meant that your information model and therefore your data model is more consistent, and that saved you from going to jail because the regulators were going to get you because your data was wrong. It just happens under the covers, doesn't it? And to your point earlier, it has to happen under the covers to a certain extent, otherwise people just glaze over at the terminology. That's to wake up anybody that fell asleep in the last 2 minutes I was talking. But it's got to happen under the covers, but it's got to be recognised. And I don't think it's recognised enough so far.
Well, great. Vernon, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to me and us today. And
anytime.
I hope to have you on a few more of these as we pick through how to elevate all these processes under the guise of strategy execution.
That would be good. Looking forward to the rest of the series, Ben. Thank you.
Cheers, Ben.
See you.